Hello to folks who are logging in. Welcome to Outward Bound's second speaker series. We're just at the top of the hour and lots of people are just starting to roll in. So we're just going to give a few minutes here just for folks to get seated and get checked in and get ready to go, but welcome. We're actually doing quite well. There's lots of folks already joining in, so I may just kick off right now. So thanks everyone for joining the Outward Bound Canada community today for our second speaker series event. I would like to start today by acknowledging that we find ourselves on the traditional territory of many Indigenous people across this place that most of us know as Canada. Specifically, myself and our guests today are on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Coast Salish nations. I'm so happy to see so many of you joining in and a few more coming every second. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Marika Chandler. I'm the Ontario Director here at Outward Bound Canada, and I'm really thrilled to be hosting today's discussion. As many of you know, Outward Bound Canada is a registered charity. We cultivate resilience, leadership, connections, and compassion through inspiring and challenging journeys of self-discovery in the natural world. And as you can imagine, the challenges and the opportunities faced by young people today are unlike any that we've faced in generations. You know, the disruption of our education, employment, access to recreation and the outdoors. Many youth are missing out on vital experiences that foster the connection to oneself, others, and nature. And we're entering our fourth month of physical distancing, and the ability and the opportunities to connect is more important than ever, as is the necessity to go outside and get away from our screens from time to time. As I mentioned, our first speaker series event with Angela Duckworth brought to the top of mind what role Outward Bound can play in the recovery efforts coming out of the pandemic. And so we're looking forward to today's fruitful discussion where we're going to talk more about building those connections with self, others, and nature. So for those of you who are joining us, there is a chat function that you'll see on the bottom right corner of your screen. And if a question does come up during today's conversation, then please, if you can just chat to everyone and write your question down, then we'll make sure at the end that we're able to come back to as many of those as possible. So without further delay, I'm really excited to announce today's guests. We have with us today Wenda Lee, and Wenda participated in her first Outward Bound course when she was 17 years old, and that had a significant impact on her subsequent education and career. Wenda went on to study forestry at Lakehead in Thunder Bay and is working at Elite Tree Care. She's held roles as a climbing arborist, a job estimator, a consulting arborist, and has worked as an instructor and technician at Humber College of Arboriculture. She's also been the Ontario Women's Tree Climbing Champion for 6 years, and in 2002 was crowned the Women's Champion at the International Tree Climbing Championship. Wenda's been a long-time supporter of Outward Bound. She attended our alumni reunion last year for our 50th anniversary and had the opportunity there to speak about her Outward Bound experience held by the Women's Empowerment Tour, which unites adventurers around Canada who are letting go of fear to create the life of their dreams. And then, of course, our other guest we have with us is Wade Davis. Wade is a writer, a photographer. His work's taken him from the Amazon to Tibet, to Africa, Australia, Polynesia, to the Arctic. I'm sure I couldn't list all of the places that you've been to. Explorer in residence with the National Geographic Society from 2000 to 2013. Currently a professor of anthropology and the chair of the BC Leadership for Culture and Ecosystems at Risk at UBC. He's the author of 22 books, including One River, The Wayfinders, Into the Silence, winner of the 2012 Samuel Johnson Prize, the top nonfiction prize in the English language. He holds a degree in anthropology and biology and received a PhD in ethnobotany from Harvard University. In 2016, he was made member of the Order of Canada. In 2018, he became an honorary citizen of Colombia. And I'd also love to highlight the fact that Wade has a book soon to be coming out called Magdalena. You can order it now, pre-ordering through Indigo or Amazon or your local favorite bookstore even. And it will be in stores in September 15th. And there's already some some advanced starring reviews. So looking forward to that coming out. So thanks for the two of you for joining us, and welcome. Now, Wade, I'd love to start with you. You know, you've been described as a combination of scientist, scholar, passionate defender of all life's diversity. Can you tell us a little bit about that description, how it came to be, and what it means to you?
Oh, that was a line that David Suzuki very generously wrote, I think, as an endorsement of an early book. And I have to say, my publishers have been milking that line. I should be giving David royalties for it. You know, I mean, David is such a wonderful guy. We all love him, and he's been such a extraordinary figure in our history. He's a deeply passionate, humane person. And, you know, I love him as a brother. I feel like I'm an uncle to his daughters. But he captured something that is what I guess I aspire to be. I never describe myself as a scientist or certainly an explorer, despite the title. I think of myself as a storyteller, you know, and I feel that the stories that we need to share these days are so important. And for me, it's always been that interface between the biological and cultural diversity, and the fact that the threat to the former is the same force eroding the latter, kind of thing. So, you know, I try both, even the way I teach at the university, I really think of myself as sort of an Irish Canadian storyteller.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic description. You're right, from David, and just the way you speak kind of emphasizes where it stems from. And now, Wenda, you've talked on one or more occasions and attributed your success in your career to your experience at Outward Bound as a teenager. And, you know, as we're focusing this discussion on the importance of connection to self, others, and nature, we know that these connections are really important to our overall well-being and our social and educational and professional development. Can you share a bit of your story with us, and you know, how your course served to develop those connections to self, others, and nature?
Sure. If you can believe it, my journey with Outward Bound started by watching a TV commercial. I was in grade 12, and I saw this commercial, and it just blew me away. At the time, my life as a student was overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time. All I did was study. Being a first generation Asian Canadian, it was in me, like, you know, just bred from my parents. You study, you get good marks, and you study. And I had no connection with nature growing up in the suburbs of Toronto. And so when I saw this commercial, something just compelled me to, I want to do this. At that time, I never camped a day in my life. I didn't even, you know, never slept in a tent. And yet I was so drawn with this program. So I convinced my father to register me for at the time, a 24-day course. And next thing you know, I'm with 11 other mixed youth in Northern Ontario, terrified out of my life. I was in a, you know, unfamiliar environment, way outside my comfort zone, and describing experiences to strangers, expressing myself in ways I've never done before. So the learning curve was very steep for me, getting used to, you know, being outdoors, being consumed by nature. And all while I was completely disconnected with nature. You could see the lake, you could see the trees. It was just background scenery for me. And it wasn't until halfway through the course, the light went on. I woke up, and I realized I was part of nature. I became grounded and connected with myself through nature. And I realized, I started looking, at trees differently. I'm not just looking at a tree or, walking through a forest. I'm, part of that. I'm in a forest. I'm not just paddling in a canoe in a lake. I'm in a lake feeling the waves and the undercurrent. And it was a watershed moment in my life because I was, full of so many negative emotions and questioning who I was. And then it was an epiphany, and I just started like being, paying attention with nature. And then as a result, paying attention with who I was, who I wasn't. And that was just the beginning. Like that was the halfway point for me. And then I knew I needed to be with nature to continue feeling those positive energies. And then I decided after the course, I need to spend the rest of my career connected with this energy. And I went on to study forestry, get my degree in there, and pursued almost a 30-year career in the field of arboriculture.
Mm-hmm. And, when we connected earlier on, Wade, you shared a story of that same period of your life, which was really interesting, that the two of you had, those really pivotal moments. And I wonder if you just want to share that as well.
Well, I think what's so important, a couple of things jumped out. Landscape holds the key to character. And, Lawrence Durrell once said you could depopulate France and resettle it with Mongolians, and within a generation of the same national traits reemerge: the affection for good living, the reflexive disdain for Americans. All these things would just come out of the soil of France. And he called it the invisible constant of a place. And in Canada, it really is our landscape that sweeps over the imagination and defines the essence of national soul. We live on the edge of the wild, and it seems to me so essential that we connect our young people to that part of our heritage, young people who we bring into the world, but also people who come from abroad and become new Canadians. And the landscape, that's why the perfect expression of our muted patriotism is that great line of Francophone verse from Gilles Vigneault: "Mon pays n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver." My country's not a country, it's the winter, right? And so I think it's just so important to get young people into the wild, to feel the rhythms of the landscape, and lives are transformed, as we've just heard. Also, we have this idea that life is linear. We project onto our students that life is linear. You go from A to B to C. If you skip D and E, you don't get to the rest of the alphabet. It's absolutely nonsensical. I mean, life is not linear. It's based on these serendipitous moments where you want to cultivate in a young person a certain openness, so that when they come to that crossroad, they will follow their heart. And if they do that all of their lives, they suddenly find themselves becoming the architect of their own life. And that is the most important creative challenge in being alive. And a career is not something that you take on like a cloak. It's something that grows around you bit by bit. Creativity, that isn't the motivation for action, it's a consequence of action, And so what happens to our young people is so critical, and giving them the exposure to the potency of those moments is what Outward Bound's all about. Taking a young person in a moment of uncertainty, perhaps, and giving them another vision of life itself. And these moments can not only be catalytic in an individual's life, they can actually take on a certain kind of almost historic significance. And I mentioned that without trying to be immodest, but when I was 14, my mother, who was a humble but determined Canadian woman, in 1968 told me that Spanish was a language of the future. And she worked as a secretary in an elementary school to save up money to allow me to join a group of schoolboys the teacher was taking to Colombia in South America. Now, Colombia was a long way away in 1968, at a time when most Canadians had never been in a commercial plane. And whereas some of the other lads on that trip became what the Colombians like to say is mamitis, they get homesick, they miss their mothers or whatever. I felt not only not homesick, I felt like I had finally found home. and something in the rhythm of the landscape and the rhythm of the spirit of the people stuck with me. And here I am now, literally more than 50 years later, an honorary citizen of Colombia. My books have been very important in the sense of holding a mirror to all that is good in the Colombian nation in the wake of all their troubles. And that seed that was sown in the young boy's heart by a kind of whimsical intuition of my mother back in 1968 has in many ways borne fruit, not just for me, but for the good work that I really have been able to do as a friend of Colombia. So these moments are so catalytic, and most of our young people do not have access to the situations in which these blossoms can bloom in the garden of human life. And Outward Bound makes those possible. I mean, Outward Bound is conceived to bring students to those moments of epiphany. I mean, that's what it's all about. And that's why it's so deserving of support.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think there's a really key piece in here, and that's that it's based on, you know, a unique group of people in a unique environment, just like you're describing, facing real problem solving scenarios. And I think, you know, the time that I've spent out with groups of youth, you know, you have some incredible moments of learning that come directly from nature itself, whether it's, you know, tipping your canoe in a whitewater rapid, or learning how to fare through a rainstorm or a really challenging day. And I wonder, I mean, Wenda, is there any moment, you know, either from that initial expedition or from now your work, I mean, nature can challenge us. Is there some lesson that's come to you along that path that stands out?
Well, like the entire time on Outward Bound was a giant lesson, and I guess something that makes me laugh now is during the 10-day canoe expedition. And there was, like, you know, what, 6 to 8 hours of canoeing every day and portaging and going back and forth, getting your gear. I had no clue what the heck was the point of this. And I kept on complaining to, you know, the other people, like to the participants. It's like, what is the point of this? I didn't understand the purpose of this expedition. We go from point A to point B, we get there, and then we're going to start something else. And it's, you know, I laugh about this now, and obviously it's not about you know, the point is, it's not about reaching the destination or reaching the summit. It's the process, it's the journey, it's what you had to give up and let go to get to that point. And the irony, or, you know, I don't know the irony, but last year I was on a day hike with some of the participants of the Reach Beyond expedition from Mont Blanc, and one of the members brought their young daughter to the hike. And as you know, we took a break. The maps were put out with the expedition. You're going to be going from this point to this point. And then this young girl, and I loved it, she said to her father, "What is the point of all this? What?" And it was like, you know, I was gifted with the reminder of how far I had come.
Wonderful.
And that, you know, when you're young, at that, you know, where your life experience is based on, you know, family and going to school, you haven't participated in a lot of things, you know, just that journey doesn't even come into play in your mind. And exactly what Wade was saying is that at that age, I was so needing a role model, and that experience imprinted so many of those experiences, and that I can relive so much of those 3 weeks. And if you ask me about any of the trips I've made in the last 15 years to a waterfall or whatever, I have a blur. but I can remember so vividly the emotions, the fear, the exhilaration. And, you know, at that age, you're just like what Wade so brilliantly said, you know, you're drinking up these catalytic events that are going to, you know, set your core values for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. That's really wonderful. It's incredible. It's incredible.
I just wanted to add, you know, I thought it was so beautiful what Wenda just said there, because, you know, in she basically distilled the perfect Buddhist path. I mean, that is the message of the Dharma, is that, or the message of any tradition based on pilgrimage. It's not the destination, it's a state of mind. It's not a goal of geography. It's a process by which you become transformed through the action. And I think that sort of sums up what both Outward Bound's all about, but also what is so essential in the upbringing of any young person. You know, I was so lucky. I never went to Outward Bound, but in a way, I mimicked Outward Bound, because for many years I worked as a foreman of these youth crews in British Columbia parks, which were really modeled on a combination of Youth Conservation Corps and Outward Bound. And even before that, I mean, at the age of 15, I grew up in the bush. So I remember people saying to me, you know, there's a forest fire up the valley 10 miles, go put it out. And if you're lucky enough, we'll build us a helipad. We might give you a ride back. And they threw up kind of beans at us and white bread. And we were just these young, I couldn't use a chainsaw at 15, you had to be 16, but we just went off and put the fire out. And I remember years later, not that many years later, when I was 20, I was asked on a whim by a British journalist who had walked the length of South America if I wanted to walk to Panama across the notorious Darien Gap in the rainy season. Well, this is 250 miles of swamp and rainforest. It was a hellacious journey. We ended up being lost with 3 indigenous people in the forest for 12 days with no food. And we emerged on the other side, and I was down to probably 60 pounds less than I am now. But the whole time, I was never once concerned or worried or frightened, because I had been honed in the wild. I'd been honed in the bush in British Columbia. I didn't worry about having to sleep out in the rain with no shelter. I didn't worry about having no food. I just did what was necessary to find our way out of a spot of trouble. And I think that kind of training really is so essential for young people. You know, I'm an anthropologist, every single culture has rites of initiation. And every one of those passage rites involves physical ordeal, often pain, isolation, trepidation. And the reason for that is very clear. The message to the adolescent must be clear. Childhood is over. A new life is beginning, a life of responsibility to the cultural survival of the collective. That's what initiation rites are about. And we don't have that in our society, with the exception of organizations like Outward Bound. And that's why we have the completely artificial construct of teenage trauma. You know, teenagers are those in between, but in between what? We create that construct. Most societies don't even have the notion of a teenager. They have a child, they have initiation, they have a man and a woman, and life moves on. And in the absence of such moments of transition in our culture, we have to do our best to ensure that our children are nevertheless exposed to them. I love when this discussion of like her first canoe trip. I had my first canoe trip in northern Quebec when I was 11, and our counselor had been mauled by a bear. And he wore these short shorts, and his entire thighs were just a map of scars. And as a little boy, I would just stare at those scars all day long and think, I want to know what that was like to be mauled by a bear, you know? And the inspiration you can get from such a moment transforms one's life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I'm okay with not knowing what it's like to be mauled by a bear, but I can understand that allure as an
I didn't
11-year-old.
want to be mailed. I didn't
No.
want to be. Wow, I thought that the guy was the coolest guy in the world, you know? I mean.
Yeah. Well, and talking about lessons that you learn from nature, you know, whether it's the bear or the swamp, you know, on that trek that you were talking about, or, you know, what Wenda's saying. It's pretty incredible. And both of your stories, whether it's going on the Outward Bound expedition or going to Colombia at that really formative stage of your life, you know, hearing how it influenced both of you is incredible. And it is that transition time that you're referring to, Wade. It's wonderful. And I think, you know, now in this world that we find ourselves in for the last 4 months, our youth are in this very different point, as I said, than they ever have been. In our last speaker series, we spoke to Izzy, who, you know, who is currently a high school student navigating that. But I'm curious if the two of you have thoughts or perspectives on how you think COVID might be impacting how youth are able to connect with others and with nature, or, you know, if you can't comment on youth, maybe just about yourself. Yeah, Wenda, why don't you go first?
Well, I'm fortunate because of my job, and I, you know, tell my other colleagues the best place to be in the middle of a pandemic is up a tree. Um, so, you know, it really didn't, like, you know, in terms of our business, we were, you know, we continued working because some of our services were deemed essential, with dangerous, you know, limbs, hazardous trees falling down. So we continued to work. But I did, you know, take 5 weeks off to, you know, so that allowed the skeleton crew to work. And during that time, I was like needing to go outside. So living in, you know, the suburbs, I just took a walk to a small little woodlot about half an hour from my house. And I just sat against an oak tree. And there's something with that connection with nature. You know, you can't think of anything else when you're just, you know, sitting underneath a tree. I don't know, there's this cleansing moment. It's like gardening, where you're just weeding. You don't watch people weed with or garden with headphones on. You were so focused on the earth, on the plants. And so, you know, with all the students, you know, being, you know, locked up, isolated in their house, and, you know, yeah, they need to go outside. Perhaps not, you know, all congregating in, you know, a giant park, but just finding like quiet time to just sit under a tree. It may be so lame, but there's an energy that of connection, and it's the only way I can say it. It's very grounding, and it sort of recalibrates your sense of self.
Yeah, well, I feel very much for young students, you know, the universities, for example, sort of feel that they have to continue to function. And yet the entire university experience is sort of being reduced to a transactional moment whereby you pay your money, you take your online courses, you get your degree, but that's not what college is all about, you know. And the problem is that, you know, any student who seeks my advice, I try to advise them to take time off until the colleges and universities are back in full flush of excitement. The problem is, of course, with the economy being what it is, and with travel being restricted, the options for alternative experiences, gap year kind of experiences, are limited. And that's where I think Wenda's right. You know, figuring out ways to find wonder in your immediate area, in the natural world around you, is maybe the ticket. I mean, I was scheduled to be in 7 countries, giving 40 speeches, having a new book launched. I was going to be from the Amazon to the deserts of Jordan. And in a kind of wonderful way, all of that went to the car wash, like everybody else's schedule. And I found myself for the first time enjoying the spring in my own garden here on Bowen Island, and planting an apple orchard. And I actually felt like a schoolboy who had woken up on the eve of a vacation he hadn't anticipated. So I actually enjoyed the hiatus, but I was obviously sympathetic with those who are suffering. But I think one thing Canadians should be very proud of is how our nation has coped with COVID. You know, the meme going around the internet right now is that to live in Canada is like owning an apartment above a meth lab. I mean, the chaos of the United States is simply unbelievable. And the chaos is happening because of the absence of social solidarity. You know, with the exception of Quebec, which had a kind of anomalous outbreak because of the quirkiness of the schedule of spring break that just brought families, bringing the COVID back to the Eastern province. If you look at the record of the Maritimes, the record of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the record of British Columbia, the fact that whereas the Navajo territory in the United States is being absolutely overrun by COVID, in Nunavut, there's been only one case. In other words, something has worked in Canada. And I try to explain to my American friends what that is. And what it is solidarity. It's not just that we have a healthcare system that is geared for the collective, not the individual, let alone for those who view a hospital bed as a rental property to be profited from. We have a social solidarity in our nation. And I always describe it this way. If you want to know the difference between Canada and the United States, tell me about the last time you got your groceries at Safeway. When you get your groceries at Safeway in the States, invariably, there is a social, economic, educational, class, racial chasm between you and the checkout person that is unbridgeable. That doesn't happen in Canada. And why not? It's because in Canada, you know that you may be more affluent than the person at the cash machine. You know that you may not be peers, but you are members of a common collective called Canada. And you know that they know that you know that they're getting a decent wage because of the unions. And you know that they know that probably your kids go to the same neighborhood public school, because we're not obsessed with private education in Canada. But third, and most essential, they know that you know that you know that they know that if their kids get sick, they get exactly the care, not only of your kids, but of the Prime Minister's kids. And those three strands woven together become the fabric of social democracy. It's often said in the United States that social democracy can never work, that the Scandinavian model is just communism light or socialism light. Well, it may well be that social democracy will never take hold in the United States. But if true, that is a stunning indictment of the failures of the American culture. And that is what we're seeing at this point in time. So I think Canada really can be very proud, certainly here in the West in British Columbia, as to how we've come together to deal with this massive crisis.
Yeah, and I think, COVID aside, you've touched on a number of factors there of, addressing diversity. And we've spoken a bit about access, to outdoor opportunities such as Outward Bound. And I think, maybe this is a good time to kind of pivot a little bit, but obviously as a charity, one of our primary goals is to increase that access. And there are disparities between Canada and the United States, and I don't want to get into the nuances of that, but I think Wenda, you've had quite a career path yourself, and similar to Wade, you've been forging as a leader in your industry, and I wonder if you can talk about some of the challenges that you've faced on your own journey, and if there's any advice that you would offer to those who are on a similar journey.
Well, when I entered into the field of arboriculture, there were very few women in this white male-dominated profession. And unfortunately, I endured many years of workplace bullying as I didn't conform into the traditional stereotype of that burly, husky, bearded tree guy. And so, I was in an environment where my peers, or I don't even want to call them colleagues, the people around me wanted me to fail. It was a threat to them to see this petite Asian woman, working side by side with them. So, it was not it was a really difficult time, the first couple of years. And a lot of what I was thriving in my career was just to be respected. And a lot of those people were just calling me, well, because we worked for a municipality, I was just a quota for hire. I was just, I was a woman, check, person of color, check. We'll hire to fill a quota. And that just you know, burned me to the core. So I worked very hard to dispel all of that. And my conviction to succeed as a respected arborist became stronger and greater than the threat of those who, you know, questioned my, you know, my work ethic, or, you know, or felt threatened by my eagerness to excel. But one thing is for sure is, without a doubt, my experience at Outward Bound that instilled these core values of, you know, the self-discipline, the perseverance, integrity, you know, experiencing, you know, fear, risk, and ultimately courage. All that that helped me get through all of what I experienced. So that was also, it leads, part of the reason why I started participating in tree climbing competitions was, what a great way, because it's to showcase your talents and the profession. And in that realm, in that arena, I wanted to gain some credibility that I was a, you know, a climbing arborist. So that's how I started into that. So I guess my advice for, you know, anybody entering, well, just experiencing those types of, you know, that type of oppression is, find a passion, find something that you're passionate about, and because that desire, that need to dream about it, to follow it, and to fulfill it, that will be greater than any of the obstacles that you're going to encounter.
It's great. I really appreciate you sharing that from your background, Wenda. And not only did you go on to become a tree climber to showcase what you could do, but you did it to a world-class championship level. So I think that speaks volumes. And, you know, diversity is something that the outdoor industry is certainly not known for being a leader in the field with diversity. And as a national organization, it's something that we are, you know, currently and have been for some time, but really currently taking more steps toward working to some positive changes in that regard. And maybe one common thread is, you know, the number of countries Wade Davis has visited is maybe similar to the number of countries that Outward Bound actually operates in, and that's 38 countries around the world on 6 different continents. And you know, that is, I think, a pretty incredible thing as an organization, but also recognizing that there is work to be done in the field. So I could continue talking to the two of you forever, but I want to make sure that we do have time for some questions that have come in. So Wade, there is a question here for you. As a person who strives for adventure and advancement as a person, how do you still accomplish finding the sense of adventure in your everyday as an adult?
Oh gosh, I'm really, go back to this idea of being a storyteller. I'm always drawn to where the story is, and I guess I come from a generation that is sort of the antithesis of the culture of self. You know, I remember when I joined the National Geographic, the marketing people there sort of asked me for all the video and still images of myself in the field. And I sort of said, what are you talking about? There aren't any. Because I mean, I don't have that. I mean, I take pride in the fact that in my, even in books of travel that I've written, I try not ever to use the word I. In fact, in this new book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, which is a story of, it's really a love letter to Colombia in many ways. It's 430 pages long, and I, for fun, counted how many times I use the word I in 430 pages, and it's only 119 times, and yet it's a first-person travel book. You know, I try not to be thinking that much of myself as much as the world outside of myself. You know, the world that I feel I need to celebrate. You know, and you know, we're living through a time when you know, half the languages of the world aren't being taught to school children. Half of humanity's knowledge is at risk. We're living through a time when anthropology's voice has become somewhat muted. when it in fact was one of the greatest sort of forces for diversity that there's ever been. You know, I mean, the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. You know, the great lesson of anthropology is that every culture has something to say, each deserves to be heard, just like none's got a monopoly in the route to the divine. You know, the lesson of anthropology is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being us, or they're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different languages. And those languages become collectively, and the knowledge embedded in those languages is our repertoire as a species for dealing with the changes and the challenges that will come to us in the next decades and centuries. And yet to live through a time when half of the humanity's voices are being silenced is a very haunting scenario. And so, you know, my mission as a storyteller is to take the world, to the extent that I can, to places where the belief systems, never to celebrate the exoticism of the other, but to take the audience to places where the beliefs are so incredibly dazzling, the intuitions are so incredibly beautiful, that you can't help but come away with a new appreciation of the wonder of culture. And you know, this is particularly important in terms of the environment, because we operate as if the way that we think of the natural world is the norm, when it in fact is highly anomalous in the human experience. You know, going back to the moment when Descartes deanimated the world and reduced every other sentient creature to just a prop upon a stage upon which the human drama unfolded, as science made a house cleaning of belief, and the idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was reduced to ridicule. Extraction and exploitation has been the way that we've dealt with an inanimate world as we see it. But most cultures around the world think of the world as being alive. They think of human beings as not the problem, but the solution. They think of reciprocity as the dynamic that should direct interactions between human beings and the natural world. The earth owes us their bounty, but we owe fidelity to the earth. And that actually is the norm. And that's why it's ironic that with climate change, it's become humanity's problem, but it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by the narrow sliver of humanity that had a particular way of thinking that came out of the Enlightenment in Europe, which gave us great things, but it didn't create the paragon of human potential. And every other voice deserves a place at the table of human counsel and wisdom.
Mm-hmm. I recall you once described language as the old growth forest of the mind. And I think that speaks to the combination of poetry and your field of research, and also speaks to what Wenda does kind of quite nicely. But you know, we're at this.
I always say that, you know, the one credential for every person who aspires to political office, if they don't know the formula of photosynthesis, they should be immediately disqualified from the race. I mean, think about it, you know, the formula of life itself. And if you don't know that, and you don't know what that means, I can't imagine how you're going to make a healthy economy.
Mm. It's a really fantastic point. And I think, you know, just highlights that we are at this kind of transition phase globally right now with what's taking place. And it is an opportunity to reshape a lot of that.
And just to get back to Outward Bound, you know, a great hero of the environmental movement in Canada, Paul George, who basically created the Western Canada Wilderness Committee and was such a pivotal figure, such a great bear of a man. I once asked him, you know, what can we really do to get people to care about the environment? He just looked at me and he said, get them into it. You know, if you don't get people into the wild, they'll never sense its rhythms. And it's like Wenda said, I mean, there is no child anywhere on earth who doesn't love bugs. There's no child that doesn't love a running river. There's no child that isn't amazed to see the size of a coastal redwood tree in California. You know, get a child into nature and they will discover the beauty of the world. And if they discover that beauty, they will protect it and they'll live with it, not against it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And maybe it'll be the child that wants to climb to the top of the tree like Wenda does. Yeah. No, that I think that's an excellent point. And, you know, that's one of the things that really motivates me to do what I do is getting the youth out there. Yeah, I think what I'm learning about these speaker series is that they fly by faster than I can imagine, and I could carry on the conversation with both of you for quite a time longer, I think. But that does bring us to the end of our time together, and I think, you know, there's been some really great things that the both of you have shared, and I just really want to thank you both for coming and offering to share your stories and your wisdom with us, and also thank those of you who've logged in to listen and watch. And I know some people will probably do so later on as the recording becomes live, but we're also nearing the end of our matching gift campaign, during which every dollar that's donated gets matched thanks to the generosity of our board of directors. So if you'd like to make a donation today, the link is here for you in the slideshow. And, you know, I of course would encourage you to do that. It does help us to get more youth back out into nature and make us sure that we have the resources to react quickly and provide greater access to youth of all walks of life. And the doubling deadline is tomorrow night at midnight. So just to put that out there, I hope folks have enjoyed the conversation. But again, Wade and Wenda, I couldn't thank you enough for your generosity in spending time with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for holding this and sharing. I feel honored to be sharing the same chat room with you, Wade. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Wenda.
And thank you, Marika, for moderating.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are going to have more speaker series coming up. We have exciting people coming. And for example, you know, we hope to be speaking to Outward Bound Oman. So keep an eye out for the details coming as for our next speaker series. But thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.